Hello and welcome to this new episode of Buzakar Law Firm podcast, brought to you by Buzakar Law Firm team. Hi, Valeria Buzakar.
Hi, how are you?
I'm good, thank you. Yourself?
Good.
So, just before we begin, 10 seconds of our listeners' time.
Yep. So we'll start with our disclaimer. As always, the information provided in this series does not and is not intended to constitute legal advice. Instead, all information is for general information purposes only.
Thanks for that. Valeria, what do you have in store for us today?
So today we're going to talk about a topic that concerns many people all the time and becomes even more acute nowadays in the midst of coronavirus pandemic. I'm talking about the landlord-tenant relationship.
Right, super important issue here, mainly due to the fact that many people during the course of a lifetime either rent or rent out their properties, and yet, surprisingly enough, not many people know enough about the rights arising out of those relationships. So, lots of questions here, and we're good to go.
So I think we'll start from introducing my friend and associate, Matthew Foggy, who is an experienced paralegal specializing in landlord-tenant boards issues, and he's a licensed real estate broker. Hi, Matthew. How are you?
Hi, Valeria. Thanks for asking. I'm perfect.
Great. I'm glad you are with us today.
Thank you. Likewise.
So, Matthew, if you were to mention only one, but the most important thing for landlords in renting out their properties, what would it be?
Well, it would be obviously to find the right tenant. And this is the most important task and the most difficult task. The question is how we will find the right tenant and who is the right tenant. My answer would be the landlord has to go through some periods of due diligence before signing any agreement. And this due diligence task would include workplace verification, pay stub verifications, salary payment verification, bank account review, references, at least two of them.
I see your point, but let me ask you, why is that so important to have those credit checks? And what do you mean when you say that landlords have only limited rights? I mean, after all, if you're not happy with a tenant, you can always ask him to move when the agreement is terminated or over, right? Or am I wrong?
Well, here's the fact. Residential tenants in Ontario do not have to automatically move out of their residence because simply their terms is over and they are at the end of their term. The landlords can ask the tenant move out of his property for limited reasons. And what are those reasons? The first one could be the landlord wants to use the property for his own use. The second reason could be because the purchaser, a potential purchaser, wants to use the same property for his own or his family's use. And the third reason could be illegal activities conducted by the tenant.
But can't landlords protect themselves by demanding certain kinds of deposits in advance?
I do understand. Some landlords are they get very much concerned and they try to demand or to act in a way that causes trouble for landlords themselves. And I can mention a few of the pitfalls that landlords may fall into. One of the pitfalls might be asking the tenant for larger deposit. We have to know that based on Residential Tenancies Act, the maximum amount of the deposit you can ask from a residential tenant should be equal to 1 month rent. And that's called last month rent. And this last month rent can only be used for non-payment of the rent. It cannot be used for damages. It cannot be used for any other purposes. The other pitfalls could be asking for pet deposit. So some landlords, if they see that the tenant has a pet, they ask for a large sum of deposits to make sure that if the damages are happening, they have some funds to repair the damages. So here's the problems. You cannot ask for a damage deposit before a damage has happened. Key deposit. Some landlords ask for large amount for key deposit, $200, $300, and I've seen sometimes $500 for key deposit. The key deposit amount should be equal to amount necessary to replace the key or the fob for the landlord, and cannot be more than that. Some landlords demand liability insurance and content insurance. and they will not let the tenant move in before getting this type of insurance. Well, I would say liability insurance is a proper demand, but content insurance demand from the tenant should be voluntarily.
So here's something that bothers everyone. What about the rent increase?
Well, it is a matter of concern, and it's a good question. Here's the guideline. We have a clear guideline on rent increase. The rent increase should be once in a year with 90 days of written notice to the tenant. Remember, the rent increase because of the pandemic for 2021 is 0%. It means that once we are in 2021, you cannot ask or demand a rent increase for
At
that
all?
year. 0%. So your 2021 rent should be equal to the rent that was paid in 2020. That does not apply to buildings and self-contained units, in addition to a house that was built after November 15, 2018 for the purpose of residency.
So one more question that concerns many tenants is if the landlord wants to sell his or her property and wants to show to the potential buyer, but the tenant refuses or stipulates it's in light of the second wave of the pandemic, what happens then?
So we have to realize we have two facts. One, tenant's right. Second, landlord's right. A tenant has an absolute right of peaceful enjoyment of the property that he or she is leasing. And the landlord has an absolute right of being able to get paid for the rent as well as being able to sell his property. How these type of two absolute rights can be dealt with. Sometimes they conflict with one another. The tenant doesn't want to move out because that's a lot of discomfort for the tenant. On the other hand, the landlord wants to sell the property because they have to sell their property. So the answer is that there should be a middle ground, and we have to accommodate the tenant's needs and the landlord's needs. And the tenants should allow showing of the properties to the landlord. Tenants cannot deny the landlord from selling their properties. At the same time, landlord has to be very considerate, not to jeopardize and risk the health of the tenant. And there are proper guidelines how to conduct a showing during the pandemics and crisis.
So you are saying that we want to remind our listeners to still stay human these days.
Absolutely, absolutely.
Always. So Matthew, from your experience, what is the best advice to landlords who are just started renting out their properties or more experienced ones?
Okay, the best advice I would say, the renting your property, first of all, I would say it's a great income opportunity for the landlord. They should not be afraid of renting their property. Here is the important point. It is extremely important to get a proper legal advice before entering a lease agreement. A well-drafted lease agreement will spare a landlord legal headaches while saving some time and money for the landlord.
Thank you, Matthew.
Thank you very much for having me.
Thanks, Matthew. Thank you, Valeria. And thanks to our listeners for being with us. We'll see you next episode. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.